The 28th of January, 1975. Just after breakfast at a sprawling colonial house in Teaneck, New Jersey, a heavily armed task force of federal agents and detectives violently kicks through the front door. Upstairs, absolute panic sets in. A woman desperately starts hurling heavy suitcases out of a second-story window. The luggage plummets, hits the frozen lawn, and violently bursts open. A blizzard of cash, hundreds, 50s, 20s, explodes into the frigid January air like green confetti. Federal agents literally scramble on their hands and knees in the frost, frantically trying to catch the bills before they blow away. When the counting finally stops, there is $584,683 sitting right there in the grass. If you've seen the Hollywood blockbuster American Gangster, you think you know the man standing in his bathrobe at the top of those stairs. Denzel Washington played him as a calm, precise, almost noble kingpin. But Hollywood sold you a massive, calculated myth. The man in the bathrobe was Frank Lucas. He was a barely literate sharecropper's son from rural North Carolina who built the most profitable heroin pipeline in American history. He did it by committing the ultimate underworld sin. He completely cut the Italian Mafia out of the drug trade, flying straight to the jungles of Southeast Asia to buy pure poison while a war raged around him. But where does Frank Lucas, the gangster, end? And Frank Lucas, the greatest sales job in American history, begin? Frank Lucas was born on the 9th of September, 1930, in La Grange, North Carolina. He was the oldest child of a desperately poor sharecropping family trying to survive the crushing depths of the Great Depression. He spent half the year without shoes, stealing chickens just to put food on the table. But the most important piece of Frank's childhood might be a complete fabrication. For 70 years, Frank swore that when he was a small boy, the Ku Klux Klan marched directly up to his family's porch and violently murdered his 12-year-old cousin Obadiah simply for looking at a white woman. Historians and journalists have never been able to verify a single shred of this story, but true or not, it was Frank's carefully curated villain origin story. He swore it was the exact moment his soul went permanently cold. What is heavily documented is what happened next. Around 1946, a 16-year-old Frank struck his boss, emptied the cash register, and fled north with everything he owned. He landed in Harlem. In the late 1940s, Harlem was an intoxicating, self-contained universe of pool halls, numbers, runners, silk suits, and dirty money moving through every single doorway. Frank slept where he could and stole the rest of the time. By his own mythologized account, he unleashed a one-man crime wave across the neighborhood, sticking up bars, snatching jewelry, and taking loaded crap games at gunpoint until half the hustlers on 8th Avenue wanted him in the ground. He was so loud, so reckless, and so exceptionally dangerous that the most powerful man in the neighborhood was forced to take notice. That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was the undisputed king of Harlem's rackets. He was a silver-haired, soft-spoken icon who played chess in the park, quoted poetry, and operated with the strict, enforced blessing of the downtown Italian Mafia. Frank claimed Bumpy took him under his wing, polished his rough edges, and kept him as his right-hand man for 15 years. Bumpy's widow, however, told a distinctly different story. She claimed Frank was nothing more than a glorified errand boy, just one of 50 street kids hanging around the great man's shadow. Regardless of his actual rank, Frank spent those years meticulously studying how real power worked. He noticed that Bumpy never touched street-level product. He collected. He arbitrated. But Frank also noticed the part he hated most. The Italians owned the supply, which meant the Italians held the leash. Even the untouchable king of Harlem was just a tenant in his own neighborhood. On the 7th of July, 1968, inside Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, Bumpy Johnson's heart finally gave out. Frank swore until his dying day that Bumpy died right in his arms, though other men in the room swore Frank wasn't even in the building. Either way, the throne was empty. A 37-year-old Frank Lucas looked at the streets and did the brutal math. Harlem pushed the heroin. Harlem took the arrests. And the Italian families took all the real money. Frank later told a reporter exactly what he wanted out of life. He wanted to be Donald Trump rich. But to get that kind of money, Frank was going to have to do something that should have gotten him immediately killed. To understand how Frank Lucas hijacked an empire, you first have to understand the brutal economics of heroin in 1968. At the time, Turkish opium moved through French laboratories in Marseille, the infamous French Connection, and straight into the hands of the New York Italian Mafia. If a Harlem dealer wanted to play, he had to buy a kilo from the Italians for up to $50,000. And by the time that kilo touched a black gangster's hands, it had already been heavily stepped on, diluted, and taxed at every single handoff. The Italians owned the pure supply, which meant they owned everybody. Frank's business insight was violently simple. Stop buying from the middleman. Find the source. In 1968, the purest, cheapest heroin on earth was bleeding out of the Golden Triangle, the dense, lawless poppy country where Burma, Laos, and Thailand violently intersect. Geographically, it happened to sit right next door to a jungle where 500,000 young Americans were actively fighting the Vietnam War. Frank didn't just see a war. He saw the ultimate, federally funded logistics network. Military flights were moving between Southeast Asia and stateside bases every single day, and U.S. Customs barely breathed on returning military aircraft. But to tap into that government pipeline, he needed an inside man. He found it in family. Leslie Ike Atkinson was a former U.S. Army Master Sergeant from North Carolina who ran a bustling joint in Bangkok called Jack's American Star Bar. The place was packed every night with black GIs on leave. Ike was married to one of Frank's cousins. They were country boys, bound by blood ties. No outsiders, no rats. The military police would eventually give Ike a legendary nickname, Sergeant Smack. By his own telling, Frank flew to Bangkok in 1969, sweating through his silk suit in Jack's American Star Bar, while Ike made the introductions. Frank always claimed he then did something almost nobody in the American underworld had ever dared. He trekked deep into the perilous poppy hills himself, spending days in the jungle to shake hands with a smiling supplier who could deliver more product than all of New York could physically swallow. Maybe it happened exactly like that. Or maybe Ike handled the heavy lifting and Frank simply improved the story for the cameras years later. But what survived every single version of the legend was the staggering price point. C'était l'ambe yuan. That was the price for a nearly pure kilo of heroin. The exact same product the Italians were selling in New York for $50,000 before the cut. When that $4,200 kilo was cut, bagged, and sold on the pavements of Harlem, it yielded roughly $250,000. But how did it cross the ocean? If you've seen the movie, you already know the most famous, horrifying part of the legend, the coffins. For decades, the myth insisted that Frank's heroin was smuggled back into America, stuffed inside the caskets of dead U.S. soldiers. Hollywood leaned into it heavily, but Ike Atkinson fiercely denied it until the day he died. There were no bodies. The reality was just as cynical, if slightly less cinematic. The heroin was hidden inside shipments of teak furniture with false bottoms, stuffed into duffel bags, and loaded onto military aircraft landing at bases like Fort Bragg, just a short drive from where Frank and Ike grew up. The product was pure. It was arriving by the ton. The money was beyond comprehension. But Frank's entire empire was built on a fatal flaw. The pipeline ran on a war, and wars eventually end. And the sheer velocity of that incoming cash was about to fuel a catastrophic explosion of ego that would bring the entire federal government crashing down on his head. While the coffins might have been a Hollywood fabrication, the product absolutely was not. It was tested, weighed, and proven in federal courtrooms. Frank branded his heroin Blue Magic. It was sold in $10 glassine bags with the name stamped proudly right on the front. In an illegal market with no storefronts, no advertising, and no refunds, that stamp was his entire promise. Frank protected it the way a massive corporation protects a secret formula. He would fly into violent rages when street dealers tried to cut his product further to stretch their profits, because every weak bag sold under his name was a direct theft of his reputation. And the reputation was terrifyingly real. Standard street dope in New York hovered around 1 to 3% purity. Blue Magic hit the pavement at roughly 10%. Addicts were literally crossing boroughs just to find it. His territory was anchored on 116th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue, and his workforce was strictly blood. He called them the Country Boys, his 5 brothers brought up from North Carolina, alongside trusted men like Avil and Vernon Lee. Frank trusted family and absolutely nobody else. The secret cutting mills moved constantly between nondescript apartments in Harlem and the Bronx. Frank always claimed that the women who cut his product were forced to work completely naked, ensuring not a single ounce of Blue Magic could walk out the door in a pocket. The numbers Frank threw around at his peak were obscene. He claimed he was clearing $1 million a day in sales, on his best days worth around $6 million in today's money. He boasted of a personal offshore fortune of $52 million parked securely in the Cayman Islands. While the feds could never definitively confirm those peak cash figures, they did confirm the massive ranch back home in North Carolina, stocked with 300 head of Black Angus cattle and a breeding bull that cost $125,000. Then came the night he painted a massive glowing bullseye on his own back. The 8th of March, 1971, Madison Square Garden, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. It was the fight of the century and the hottest ticket in the history of New York. Frank sat dead center at ringside, seated closer to the action than the Italian Mafia bosses. He was wearing a floor-length chinchilla coat that cost $100,000, paired with a matching hat that cost $25,000 more, a lavish gift from his fiercely devoted wife, Julie. Every single camera in the building swept past him, and buried in the crowd, federal narcotics agents and NYPD detectives nudged each other and asked the exact same quiet question, "Who is that?" Frank later admitted it was the dumbest thing he ever did, claiming he never wore the coat again. But it was too late. He was now a face. He should have cashed out that night. Instead, he went back to 116th Street and ordered more kilos. But the country's political machinery was violently turning against him. On the 17th of June, 1971, President Richard Nixon stood in front of national cameras and declared drug abuse America's public enemy number 1. By July 1973, the government created a brand new, highly militarized agency with one single job, the DEA. For a while, Frank was insulated by the oldest shield in New York: corrupt cops. The elite narcotics detectives of the NYPD's Special Investigations Unit routinely shook down dealers, taking cash and reselling product. Frank paid the tax just like everyone else. But that shield was rotting from the inside out. Of the roughly 70 detectives who passed through that elite unit, more than 50 were eventually indicted or implicated. By late 1974, Frank's impenetrable pipeline was cracking wide open. Federal agents had quietly flipped couriers, moving the product. Wiretaps were live on the Country Boys, catching his brothers being disastrously sloppy on the phones. And across the river in New Jersey, a relentless investigator named Richie Roberts, a man with a freakish reputation for being completely unbribable, was building massive case files with Frank's name on the cover. 2 distinct investigations, 2 separate states, 1 target. The federal strike force was finally tracking Blue Magic backwards, from the pavement to the source, setting the stage for a freezing January morning that would blow Frank's empire across the front lawn. On the freezing morning of the 28th of January, 1975, the unmarked cars quietly turned onto Frank Lucas's pristine, tree-lined street in Teaneck, New Jersey. The federal takedown was executed piece by piece, reversing the exact same blueprint Frank had used to build his empire. The government's opportunity was Frank's massive, insurmountable cash problem. Criminal empires of that scale inevitably bleed a devastating paper trail of property deeds, safe deposit boxes, and duffel bags of physical cash that simply cannot fit into any legitimate bank. The inside connection was his own pipeline, flipped couriers, who had quietly fed routes, dates, and names directly to the government. The execution came right at breakfast, and it played out in chaotic, agonizing slow motion. Cars sealed both ends of the quiet suburban street. Heavy fists pounded on the front door before the wood finally gave way to battering rams and the thunder of boots storming up the stairs. Up in the master bedroom, Frank's wife, Julie, realized the walls had finally closed in. In a desperate panic, she dragged heavy suitcases to the bedroom window and heaved them out into the freezing January air. They hit the frozen lawn and burst violently open, sending $584,683 in physical cash erupting across the grass like green confetti. Federal agents literally dropped to their knees, shouting and scrambling to pin the hundreds and fifties to the frost before the winter wind could carry them away. And in the middle of this absolute chaos stood Frank Lucas, wearing his bathrobe, as calm as a Sunday morning. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just quietly asked to see the warrant. He had meticulously rehearsed this exact nightmare in his head for years, but the mental preparation didn't matter, because the physical money was everything. Along with $500,000 counted straight off the grass, agents seized keys to hidden safe deposit boxes, illicit property deeds, and a mountain of paperwork pointing directly to offshore accounts. The government had him, and they had him twice. In 1976, a federal jury found Frank Lucas guilty, and a judge brought the hammer down with staggering force: 70 years in federal prison. To ensure he never saw daylight again, the state of New Jersey piled on with its own separate conviction. The special narcotics prosecutor publicly declared Frank's operation one of the most outrageous international dope smuggling gangs ever. At 45 years old, the king of 116th Street was completely finished. He was staring down a permanent concrete coffin. But this is where the Hollywood myth fractures completely. A man who moves tens of millions of dollars in illegal narcotics doesn't just quietly accept a life sentence. Frank Lucas was broke. His empire was incinerated, and his product was gone. But he still had one final devastating currency left in his pocket. And to buy back his freedom, he was going to spend every single person he had ever known. This is the part of the story no major Hollywood studio would ever willingly put in a trailer. When Denzel Washington played Frank Lucas, he gave the audience a gangster of deep, uncompromising principles, a stoic, honorable kingpin who took his massive fall like a man. It was a beautiful cinematic lie. The brutal, unforgiving truth is that Frank Lucas immediately became one of the most prolific, destructive informants in the history of the American drug war. Sitting across a metal table from the exact same federal agents who had just hunted him down, Frank realized he had only one currency left to trade, so he spent every one. He unspooled everything: names, smuggling routes, offshore accounts, stash houses, and the identities of corrupt cops. He sold out the country boys. He sold out the blood relatives who had moved his product. He completely dismantled the massive, multi-million-dollar pipeline he had spent a decade building. His sprawling confessions fueled sweeping federal indictments that produced roughly 100 convictions. He was so incredibly productive for the government that they placed the former king of Harlem and his family directly into the witness protection program. In 1981, his crushing 70-year sentence was quietly reduced to time served plus lifetime parole. Let that terrifying math sink in. He served exactly 5 years of a 70-year sentence, and he paid for it with the freedom of every single person who had ever trusted him. But Frank couldn't stay a ghost forever. By 1984, the millions were gone, the Cayman accounts had mysteriously evaporated, and the street was calling him back. He was arrested again, caught red-handed trying to trade an ounce of heroin and a stack of cash for a kilo of cocaine. He was slammed with a new 7-year sentence. But this arrest came with a twist so absurdly surreal that if a screenwriter pitched it, they would be laughed out of the room. The defense attorney standing up in court to vigorously represent Frank Lucas was Richie Roberts, the exact same unbribable New Jersey Fed who had led the relentless crusade to lock Frank in a cage was now his lawyer. The cop who destroyed his empire eventually became his closest confidant, and remarkably, the godfather to Frank's own son, Ray. The physical empire was dead, but the legend was just taking breath. Decades later, when American Gangster hit theaters, the ending title cards proudly claim that Frank's cooperation directly led to the conviction of 3/4 of New York's federal drug agents. It was a flat-out, fabricated lie. Not a single DEA agent was convicted because of Frank Lucas. Real federal agents were so deeply enraged by the film's total historical fabrication that they actually sued the studio, which leaves us with one final, haunting realization. The movie had to lie, because the myth of Frank Lucas had finally grown far too big for the truth to contain. Everyone else in this bloody saga got an ending, too. Ike Atkinson, Sergeant Smack, spent roughly 3 decades rotting behind bars and walked out in 2007, an old man who vehemently denied the coffin myth until his dying breath. Julie did her own short stretch in prison, quietly went home to Puerto Rico, and miraculously reunited with Frank in 2006, still fiercely in love with him after all the betrayals. Harlem's other heroin kingpin, Nicky Barnes, the man the press dubbed Mr. Untouchable, eventually broke and flipped on his own syndicate, too. Because that's the ugly, cynical reality. The rap songs and the mob movies never advertise. At the absolute top of the underworld, everybody talks. But it was Harlem itself that was forced to pay the real bill. A massive, devastating hole was torn through an entire generation, completely hollowed out by the agonizing grip of the product Frank Lucas had so ruthlessly perfected. Frank Lucas died on the 30th of May 2019 in New Jersey. He was 88 years old. He managed to outlive his massive empire. He outlived his bitter enemies. And most importantly, he outlived almost every single person who could actually contradict his version of history. Which leaves us with the final, unvarnished truth of this entire story. Frank Lucas was a brilliant, cold-blooded survivor who destroyed his own community for a chinchilla coat and then sold out his own family just to save his own skin. His purest, most profitable product was never actually blue magic. It was the story of Frank Lucas, and half a century later, millions of people are still buying it. If this deep dive pulled you in, hit subscribe and ring the bell for the real unfiltered stories behind the legends. Drop a comment below. Who should we expose next? Nicky Barnes or the real Bumpy Johnson?